it's really a joy to be here at BIC and talk about this work. So shout out to Ravi and Anand. And Anand was very kind. He said, look, please be sure to dumb it down. And I think I need to smart it up because when I talk to my engineering colleagues, it's a whole different ballgame. Whereas talking to people who are more on the policy side of things and the general public, the impact of what we do is so profound and so game-changing that it's really wonderful to be addressing this to a general audience. So without further ado, I am at UMBC, which is one of the campuses of the University of Maryland system, and it's sort of the third largest research university, Johns Hopkins and College Park being the others. And the location is extremely strategic, and you'll see why that's important in a little bit. 40 minutes from the White House and 20 minutes from the medical school here. And our medical school was recently featured as the first pig heart that was transplanted into a human. It made the news a couple of weeks ago. My own labs have sort of been predictive. When I was young, my older cousins will say I was a holy terror, and many aunts and uncles would say that you're going to end up in a reform school someday. And it came true. So this is a former juvenile detention center that now houses my labs, and I've been there for 34 years. And so some things are meant to be. What we were known for was really innovation in the pharma space. And our lab's claim to fame was coming up with sensor technology that was contactless. So you could take a little postage stamp, piece of sellotape, it was highly functionalized, stick it into any vessel, and by shining light on it, you can measure the oxygen, the pH, things like that. Now, why is that important? When you grow cells to produce vaccines or any medicines, it's very important to control the oxygen level. Much as we breathe, it's the same physiology. And so by having a sensor that you don't need to poke a hole into a vessel suddenly meant that you could enable even a simple plastic bag to become a high-tech bioreactor. And in fact, this is what has helped us to produce the COVID vaccines in record time. Otherwise, these processes would be very slow and inefficient. So this was the past, but I wasn't happy delivering solutions to already very wealthy companies and making them richer. And a lot of this we did to kind of push the envelope, make things cheaper, better, faster. Much of our work was commercialized. Inspired by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, really wanted to set up something that was broadly focused for a humanitarian impact. And what we're about is coming up with disruptive innovation, really focused on reducing healthcare costs. And COVID, if anything, has amplified that need. And what makes us different from most academic labs is the integration of multiple processes and technologies, and at the same time connecting with policymakers. And I'll give you several examples of this. Just to kind of wrap your head around disruptive innovation, look at this list. Had COVID happened 20 years ago, we would be in really bad shape. Despite COVID, now with Zoom and all these technologies being available that simply didn't exist 20 years ago, we've had some semblance of being able to function and be productive. And all these technologies are really enabling technologies. But these technologies also come at a cost because we now have extremes of climate, extreme polarization in our political dialogue. The pandemic has really affected every one of us. Poverty, the inequities, and the lack of justice, social justice. So the world really is in turmoil. And so what our theme now is how can we harness the power of technology to address some of these issues? And so that's what we're about. Next slide. So one of the things that's happening in healthcare is if you look at the global landscape, most of us, if you need a major procedure, you're pretty much stuck going to a major hospital, a Manipal or a Fortis or what have you. What's happening now, if you could advance it, is that you keep moving the technologies to sort of almost to the home level. And a good example of this is, for example, home blood glucose monitoring. Our parents had to drop off a sample at a lab. Now anyone who's a diabetic has a portable glucometer that they can readily get their blood glucose level. So this democratization of medicine is happening all around us. Next slide, please. And so one of the nice things about our location, being right next to Washington, D.C., is a lot of sort of thought leaders are in our immediate neighborhood. So I've been very fortunate to host many of them. This is Norm Augustine, who's the CEO of Lockheed Martin and Procter & Gamble. And one of his sort of very astute observations is modeling what industries are going to look like in the future. And he's done a lot to look at the defense industry because he was CEO of Lockheed Martin. And so I said, can you help us understand what's happening with the paradigm shifts in healthcare? Now, this slide was just made a couple of years ago, but it's completely needs to be redone. And I don't even have the new numbers because nobody knows what the costs of COVID-19 are going to be. So everything is now sort of been reset and not in a good way. Everything's going to be much, much more expensive. And right now, in 2018, the US was spending close to 20% of GDP on healthcare. This is out of control. It's unsustainable. Next slide. And what's really sad is people are getting bankrupt. Even with health insurance, most insurance policies in the US have co-pays. So you have to pay $100 or whatever every time you see a doctor, maybe more if it's an expensive surgical procedure. And so that is really, these are friends and neighbors. I personally know people who are going through this, who are literally bankrupt. And so that's just from the US scale of things. But what about the entire world? Most of the people around us live on less than $10 a day. And that is bad. And even in a rich country like the US, if you're making $80,000 a year for a family of four, you're considered wealthy or well off. And these are not my statistics, this is from Pew. Now imagine somebody in that family getting cancer. The average treatment is $100,000 a year. So it is absolutely out of control and unsustainable. If you look further down, and again, take a lot of inspiration from Gandhi to really look at sort of what we can do for the broadest section of humanity. And this is something that continues to inspire us, and I sort of share this with every student of mine. If you look at the world map on people living on less than $1 a day, it's even more stark. And so how are we going to get healthcare to all the helpless faces that Barkada just showed in her slideshow? So it needs a complete reset. And I was fortunate at this time, the lab was focused, well known in the bio-farm world. This person walked into my life. Steve Falk is the chief engineer of GE Healthcare's maternal infant care division. And he had just come for a visit to the lab to learn about our sensor technologies. And he's like, dude, what do you know about neonates? And I'm like, not a lot. I don't know much about neonates. I'm a biochemical engineer. I work on producing pharmaceuticals. So he gave me a crash course on what it costs to keep a baby alive in a neonatal intensive care unit. A premature baby needs an extraordinary level of care, and these numbers are staggering for people who have insurance and can afford it. Those who don't, it's basically they're out of luck. And it's even more insidious because if you're a premature baby, your brain isn't particularly developed. And so if that happens, you're stuck with basically having all kinds of side effects down the road. And literally, it's a life sentence to live a life that's subpar at many levels. And these are things that people go through, and the numbers are truly staggering. So how do you help a premature child? You keep them in an environment that replicates the mother's womb. So you just put the baby in an incubator. And if you have them in an incubator, you have to measure the temperature. How do you measure temperature? You stick a sensor on the baby. Unfortunately, a premature baby has such poorly formed skin that it hardly exists. And every time you want to remove the temperature sensor, this is what happens. Very painful, very prone to infection. So it's one of the most sort of difficult cases to treat. And so when Steve came to my lab, we had a side project that was just describing a molecule that as the temperature increases, it becomes more and more dim. Okay? So he was very excited to see this, and he said, can you make us a non-contact temperature sensor? And I said, I don't see why not. And so this led to this concept where we would have a sensor where you wouldn't have to put a wire or anything on the baby. Now, you might wonder that what's the big deal? Everywhere now, airports, everywhere, someone's scanning your hand. So why is this so difficult? The reason it's very hard is you have this heater over here in an incubator that's shining a powerful beam of infrared light. So those scanners that you use to get into the mall or the airport, they're useless. They'll be swamped. You won't get any measurement. So it's an extraordinary technical challenge to make the measurement even in the face of a heater that's continuously bathing the baby. And that's what we did. So this attracted a lot of attention because babies, everyone loves babies, and that brought the CEO of GE to the lab. So Jeff Immelt showed up with his entourage. And this is where I realized the impact at a human level. So wherever Jeff travels, he travels with the bodyguard, tough ex-New York cop. And so when I was showing this picture of a neonate, the guy's, crying. And so afterwards, he tells me his grandchild was a preemie, and he was just remembering the trauma of that. So, even the toughest person in the face of sort of this kind of trauma is deeply affected. And so Jeff was very impressed, and I'll come back to the story about Jeff and what happened with GE. But separately, Steve taught me some other very sort of disturbing statistics. And that is that every 10 seconds, a baby, a neonate dies. Now that's tragic, but it becomes even more horribly tragic if you consider the fact that it's preventable. Most of these babies die because they're too cold or they get an infection. And so these are all preventable deaths. And so we said, can we do something about it? And so this is where my journey began. I sketched out a crude sketch and I said, okay, we could do better, come up with an incubator that's suitable for the developing world, use inexpensive parts like a headlamp from a 12-volt truck headlight as a heater source, solar powered, and then also for places like sub-Saharan Africa, the hot Indian summer, come up with a way to cool the incubator. And what would be easier than to use a conventional mud pot with water? Can we do this? And so I pitched this concept to a funding agency called VentureWell, which basically funds social entrepreneurship. They loved the concept and they gave us $50,000 to start. That was enough for a start. And then I wanted to reach out to the Gates Foundation USAID. And that's where I hit a big stumbling block because they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to touch it. So I was a finalist in their big competition 4 times in a row, and every single time they would reject me. So I was like, okay, what's the deal here? Why are you doing this? Because you're telling me on one side that this is the kind of innovation you want to see, but on the other hand, you're not funding us. You're basically calling us all the way to the finals, and it's a huge effort to get there, and then you're just pulling the plug. So after drilling down, I come to find out that they're afraid that this cardboard incubator will disrupt what's called kangaroo mother care, which is the standard of care. And I'll explain that in a minute here. And so, but before we got there, to the last mile, there were many people that helped us along the way. And one was a journalist, Jyoti Pandey Lavakre, who I reached out cold. She opened her Rolodex and connected me to all kinds of people, Nachiket Moore, and then various people, so many people. But the pushback from the establishment was tough. So it's easy, it's very, very lofty to talk about disruptive innovation, but that is sort of a double-edged sword. When you're disrupting something, there is the establishment that'll push back very aggressively. And so that's what I've had to face. Now, I did luck out that the FDA had a pediatric device innovation arm, and so we applied to them for a $50,000 grant. Same thing. The committee was bitterly divided. Half of them said this is a genius idea. The other half said it's a crackpot idea. But luckily, the program manager said, okay, let's split the difference, give this guy half the money. So that at least got us started. And then when we finished the prototype that we were able to build, we went back to them. They gave us another $50,000, and that helped us to complete the story. So now we started on our journey. And let me tell you about kangaroo mother care, which is what we're competing against. This is something that USAID and many development agencies have pushed, W Health Organization. It's a very simple concept. The idea is keep the baby next to the mom. as much as possible, skin to skin contact. And so you have these training manuals developed by WHO and the USAID that show this, and they give rather paternalistic advice on how the woman's husband may help with KMC, or how the sister can keep the baby strapped to her chest while the mother does something else, or the mother takes a shower. These are illustrations I've lifted straight from the manual. Okay, so smacks a little bit of a colonial top down, and then it gets worse. This shows the father saying how you father can hold the baby against the chest, nicely read a book, but look what they do to the mother. The mother has to cook and continue to work while holding the child. So, some of these messages are, I find, not really appropriate for this day and age. And partly, I don't think the people there understand that in the developing world, most of the women are day laborers. If they don't work that day, they don't get paid, they don't eat. So there's some real social factors. And so that's what we started going and sort of drilling down into. So, but before that, I needed a commercial partner. And I was very fortunate to run across the managing director of Phoenix Medical Systems. This is Shashi Kumar and his CTO, Arun Venkatesan. So I brought a bunch of students and colleagues, and we had an interpreter and an early childhood development person with us, Geeta Ram. She's also here with me today. So we went down to the last mile, and Shashi was fantastic. I said, Shashi, I want to do this because we need this in the millions. Will you help us? And he said, sure. I said, you realize this will cannibalize your own business? He said, sure, but it's the right thing to do. And so he signed up on the spot, and I said, Shashi, one more thing. I don't want this to become something that becomes a high profit margin. He said, no, but I have to make a profit. I'm a company, but I'll keep it so as close to cost as possible. And that was just a breath of fresh air. And so with that start, we started drilling down to visiting primary healthcare centers. And it was amazing. People, the ex-vice chancellor of Mysore University, Dr. Prasad, this is Dr. Sudarshan, Padma Shri, running with Karuna Trust, a primary healthcare center. And I have to say, I'm embarrassed. I grew up in India, but I had no clue about the rural healthcare landscape. This one facility with one doctor, one pharmacist, and 3 nurses looks after 25,000 people. I mean, it is just staggering in terms of the access to healthcare. And ironically, my student got a nosebleed, and the nurse there just quickly and efficiently just treated him. No bill, no paperwork, nothing. So, I always point this out as how the Indian healthcare system is superior compared to the US in some ways. But going into the healthcare center, this is their one physician, Dr. Sharath, who showed us how he takes care of a baby born early in the morning. To keep them warm, he has to shine a table lamp on them. And so this is something that was glaringly obvious that our incubator certainly had a lot of potential here, to the point when we described the concept to him, he thought it was already ready, and he was almost in tears. He's like, I want one now. And we said, okay, we'll get you one, you're on the list. And then Dr. Balu Balasubramanian, another very inspiring person who basically right out of medical school started working among the tribals, providing healthcare to them and education. So he took us for a deep dive through his tribal hospital in Sargur. And this was, again, amazing. So what happened here was we reached out to all the nurses and midwives, the people who actually are the caregivers in the labor and delivery ward and do the work. And something very interesting happened here. So I was there. We gave the pitch. We said, we'd love to hear what you think. Nothing. Really nothing came out of them. And for some reason, Dr. Balu and Prasad and I left for another meeting. We come back and, Geeta's laughing and chatting and, so it taught me a valuable lesson. Take the men out of the room when you're trying to get something from a bunch of women field workers. They are just not going to speak when there's an authority figure in the room. And with these students were just kids, and we elicited so much valuable market data. This is sort of a list that they told us what all is needed, and some very, very sort of non-obvious things, such as, so vector control, mosquito bites would be less, the ability to filter the air for the infant. And this was an amazing thing. So in the labor and delivery room, if you have a low birth weight baby, there is a specialized room with incubators, but it's 5 minutes down the hall. And these young mothers, according to the nurses, would be traumatized to be separated from the baby. And, in those hospital settings, there's always a fear of the male child being taken away or a mix-up, getting the wrong baby back because there is no ID, nothing. So extremely difficult. So the nurses said, if you can make this cheap enough so you can keep it next to mom, it would be a game changer. And again, nobody's ever done that. And the other problem we found is that many well-meaning NGOs, et cetera, donate these incubators, that once they stop working, they're just gathering dust. They're not really of much use. And then we continued our research work, showed that, the temperature will get controlled. We built many sort of design mock-ups and things, and also had a lot of pitch decks to try and get more investment. And also talked to the policy leaders. This is Alan Guttmacher, who's the former director of the National Institute of Child and Human Development. That's our university president, just to show them that we've built a prototype. It's running off a motorcycle battery and it has the ability to control temperature, made out of cardboard. And we also had to publish it, to validate it, so that the scientific community would accept these results. And the other interesting thing was, by making it a cardboard incubator, it becomes a single-use incubator. And this physician who helped us, happens to be my wife, also guided us to the fact that you can really cut down the rate of acquired infections in the hospital. And the nurses loved it because they hate cleaning the incubators between babies. And so how we do this is really, I have a talented engineering team at my disposal every semester. And they're highly motivated because if it doesn't work, they don't pass the class. So that's a wonderful way of, and I don't pay them, they pay me. So it's a very different business model. And the other thing I do is engage a lot of female engineers because I'm concerned about women washing out of the engineering workforce. And so empowerment is part of what we do. So not only do they do this, but they then have to go present their results and talk about it in a scientific setting. So this then led to our first generation model. And this is Dr. Binu Nainen, who is the head of neonatology at Ramchandra Medical College. And they agreed to partner with us. And this then is the entire engineering team at Phoenix that led to the development of this work. And finally, this is the end product. So it's remarkably simple, designed out of cardboard and to be entirely biodegradable, because one thing I didn't want to do was generate plastic waste in the rural areas where, God knows we have a solid waste problem already. Didn't want to add to that. And it's completely flat packable. So you can put the entire thing, storage isn't an issue. And even the way this is shaped, you might wonder why we have this odd trapezoidal shape. That's because we did a lot of market research. That suggestion came from a midwife in the Philippines who said our original design, which was just a cardboard box because that's the easiest to manufacture, she said it resembles a coffin. And that is not something any young mother would want to put their child in. So we changed the shape. So, these are the kinds of things that you never really think about, you're not taught in school. And that's where that last mile, talking to who the end user is, becomes remarkably important. And so this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. And the Ramchandra Medical College team did what's called a non-inferiority trial, where the standard of care is this higher-end incubator that they normally use in the lab. And the exact same controller powers the cardboard one. Because the other thing I wanted to be careful about, it was a really a difficult moment for me. One of the people I saw was Atul Tiwari, who was the Karnataka Health Secretary. And long story short, it took me about 5 hours of waiting outside his office to get a 3-minute meeting with him because he's pulled in so many different directions. Very nice guy. But I'll never forget his first question to me. Dr. Rao, are you experimenting on our children? And it was really eye-opening for me to make sure that that is never something that becomes the story. And so we're very careful to point out that all the electronics, control, circuitry, everything is identical to what's used in a regular hospital unit. And more importantly, the other thing I did was I filed a patent, provisional patent, and let it expire. what that means is nobody can patent this. It's now in the public domain. So it becomes something that's open source that people can build on. So none of this sort of, so the other things that we've done now, we've got a lot of, and again, I'm deeply grateful to all these mothers who signed informed consent, allowing the study to be carried out in a cardboard incubator. I'm not sure I would do that with my own kids. Sometimes I wonder about these experimental therapies. So just amazing that they were willing to do it. And the reason we did it in a tertiary care hospital was that we had the best facilities. If there was something that could go wrong, we could immediately pull the plug on the trial. So the trial worked, and what's even more amazing, the cardboard incubators were all squeaky clean, whereas the regular incubators actually ended up, 2 out of the 48 that were used had the bacteria in them. So potentially there was an infection risk. So that pretty much validated our idea that the cardboard incubator would be a superior vehicle. And so this really, Ashok Chandrasekharan, amazing, brilliant young neonatologist who did all the work, ended up with a Global Health Award from the Association of Pediatric Societies for this incubator. So that's been amazing. And then there's also a publication that's come out in eClinical Medicine, that's the Lancet family. So the non-inferiority trial is now published. So where do I go from here? I'm still trying to get traction. And this is one of the things, while I was trying with Gates year after year and they rejected us, I said, okay, let's not focus on kangaroo mother care. Let's talk about the other sensors that can go into this incubator. So we built a prototype that can transmit the baby's image and weight. And so where this becomes important is now it opens the world for telemedicine applications. And so the fact that you can readily access the weight and image of the baby, you can tackle something that's really startling. So these are numbers from Karnataka, not sub-Saharan Africa. Look at this, underweight kids, 56% in Kalaburgai, in Raichur, in Koppal, all the North Karnataka. It is just amazing what a problem it is. And these are kids sharing midday meals, but it's one plate, 2 kids. So it gets even worse if you go back to the low birth weight infants whose brains are still developing. And so what we came up with this concept was that you can take the fact that you can transmit the baby's weight and image and really come up with this kind of architecture, because India is way ahead of any other place. And you could tackle malnutrition right from the get-go. And so, of course, I went to see Mr. IT, and Nandan was very gracious and said, you know what, I'm focused on fintech. Let me work out the bugs in that, and then we'll be ready for you in a couple of years. So this is something that hopefully we'll be able to leverage and get an architecture where no child in Karnataka or anywhere in the world has to be malnourished. So let me switch gears again. So when Jeff Immelt was there, he said, I'd like to kind of see what you can do with other sensing technologies. And he funded us to come up with sensors for glucose and respiration and cardiac. And so the idea was, can we extend our ability? If you watch Star Trek, the physician scans the patient and all the numbers show up. And so we've come up with technologies that move away from the fact that you have to take a blood sample from an infant, or you have to heat the skin to get a measurement, and to come up with a very simple way of making measurements that measure gases that are leaking across the skin. So all of us have oxygen and CO2 in us that's always leaking out. And turns out it's fairly straightforward to measure it if you have the right approach. So if you take a hollow stethoscope-like sampler, put it against the skin, flush it with nitrogen, so there's no gas, no CO2 or oxygen in it, and then you flip a valve and circulate the gas past the sensors, what happens is that your skin leaks the CO2 and oxygen outside. And so by measuring how fast it's coming out, you're able to know how much CO2 and oxygen there is in the body. Very similar to, if you want to know how much water is in your overhead tank, you open your tap. If it's rushing out, your tank's pretty full. If it's trickling out, your tank's close to empty. Same concept. And then so we've now trained nurses and physicians to use this. And this is a 24-week baby in the NICU that has a needle stuck into them for a blood sample. And our sampler is held against the baby's skin. And no pain, no needles, nothing. And these are the data. So our system works as well as the conventional measurement. So you could actually get completely pain-free monitoring. And so we're now building prototypes, again, using our students. And I also sit and volunteer for many of these tests. So yeah, this is a fake smile because this is a glucose tolerance test. It's highly unpleasant, no matter how much you like sweets, to drink 75 grams of glucose in one shot. So it was a miserable feeling after that. Next. And then what we did with this was built a little handheld version and really applied it to COVID. So most of us have been spending, next slide, the past couple of years. So we wanted to see what masks are doing to us. So this was a study where the postdoc wore different kinds of masks and face shields. And again, some of this was inspired by the healthcare workers that I encountered, including my own physician, who looked absolutely miserable behind 2 masks and a face shield and said he just couldn't wait to get home and take it all off. Turns out, if you have these masks, the better the mask, the more the CO2 builds up in you, because it makes sense, right? You want to prevent any leaking. And this is my personal theory to why people are going nuts on airplanes. The air is recirculating. You've got your mask, your CO2 levels are building up, and it's well known that CO2 levels building up makes you highly irritable. So this is something that I need some psychologist collaborators to try and study. The other interesting thing, long COVID, we came up with a very rapidly responding oxygen sensor that measures how much oxygen is in your breath when you breathe out. And the take-home message is that healthy participants are able to take out much more oxygen from air than people who have recovered from SARS-CoV-2. And that's because there's some damage to your lung cells. So you literally feel more tired, less energy. It's all because your ability to absorb oxygen has gone down. The other thing we're doing is really coming up with glucose sensors. And again, social change, I'm very proud, shout out my first Black undergrad student presenting at a conference. I mean, in this day and age, after George Floyd and everything else, it's amazing what a gulf there is in opportunity for minority students. And so we're trying to do something about that too, train the next generation. One more thing that's happening is with these painless sensors, people are not really compliant with taking their medicine. Either they forget or a prescription runs out, variety of reasons that people worry about this. So we're saying, okay, can we use our sensors to come up with a simple way of monitoring the metabolic status of people? Integrate something that you do every day and make it happen. And this is our solution. The idea is, can you integrate into a toilet seat all the transdermal sensors and monitor your various physiological parameters on a daily basis? Connect it, next slide, to the cloud and basically do population scale monitoring in a very simple way. And again, this is an opportunity for a smart IT company to get on this and do this kind of deep dive into the metabolism at a population level, something that's never been done before. And this is a student volunteer testing out the concept. So let me switch gears now to the making medicines part. This is one of the most inspiring people I've had the privilege of meeting, retired Colonel Jeff Ling, who's one of the world's foremost experts on traumatic brain injury. Jeff was a colonel in the army. He's an army doctor who did 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while he was there, he was very frustrated with the lack of ability to get medicines. And so he said, I'm a DARPA program manager. Let me challenge the community, next slide, to replace sort of a traditional biocon-like facility with large fermentation tanks with a small, agile manufacturing system that can fit in a suitcase. Next slide. So We did this by using a cell extract. Now, most of us know the basic biology. Your cell has a nucleus that has all the instructions to make your proteins. And so the nucleus, the DNA becomes RNA that then becomes protein. It turns out if you take a cell and make an extract out of it, you're able to basically make a freeze-dried product. So the analogy I can use is powdered milk. So you just add water, you get milk back. You can do the same thing to a living cell and basically reconstitute it. And by simply adding the DNA of interest, you're able to produce your medicine. First sort of demonstration of a portable manufacturing factory about the size of a suitcase. And so we did this demonstration, and I was extremely moved by Jeff Ling's reaction. He said, imagine if this were in a village in Nigeria. So it was really sort of the approach of transforming humanity's ability to produce medicines at sort of a grassroots level and really empower people anywhere in the world to make medicine. Next slide. US Air Force pilots making it. Then this is our suitcase prototype that we've developed. Next slide. And we've built even smaller versions of it in a briefcase. Next slide. And a lot of recipes are automated. So a computer controls everything and allows you to make the drugs. Next slide. And we've also produced it at military bases just to show demonstrations. Next slide. So while we were doing this, Zika happened. And we were able to show that with this system, next slide. Next slide. We were able to produce medicines very quickly. We've also advanced the technology where one could use your own blood as the source to produce medicines. Next slide. Next slide. We'll skip some of these. And so the one back. Here is something that could be the hospital of the future or in your own home. You could have a little cartridge that you produce your medicine when you need it. So there's no worry about refrigeration, things expiring, etc. So this is sort of a concept that we work with the Johns Hopkins University Pharmacy. And so, because things like wastage or supply chain, all these are big issues, and COVID has only amplified that. So imagine if you had the power to make your own medicine. And one of the most fascinating things, I was giving a talk, and there was a guy in the front furiously scribbling away. So I was like, wow, this must be some student who's really interested in it. And after the talk, he came up and introduced himself. So I said, oh, what are you doing? And he said, I'm with Amazon. So they're already scouting technologies that are 10 years down the road that they could potentially use to make and deliver medicines on demand. So this is the future. Next slide. So this has attracted a lot of buzz, magazine covers, etc. But really, it hits home when you see something like this. One of my colleagues, his wife got cancer. She had radiation therapy, was prescribed 5 injections of the same stuff we make in our briefcase. $12,000 per injection. Now, where is somebody, even in the US, who's considered wealthy on a salary of $80,000 a year going to afford this? So there's a real element of social justice that's lacking. And so my hope is that this technology will empower people, next slide, to make it. So partly I have to deal with regulators. This is Dr. Janet Woodcock, who's the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation Research at the FDA. And she said, look, your system's amazing, but you need to understand that you'll have to change the laws to allow yourself to use this. So next slide. And I'm also trying to work with the Indian pharma. So Kiran's an old friend. And this is actually a funny story. This is at her hotel in Washington. She was supposed to visit my lab, and she called and said, very sadly, I'm not allowed to leave my hotel. She had come with Prime Minister Modi for a delegation, and so meetings were being hastily arranged, and so she was locked up in her hotel, literally. So I said, no problem, I'll come see you. And so she was so happy to see a familiar face, so we had a great time together. Next slide. So we've built even next generation visions of this, and the next slide. So someday, COVID's going to come. But something much worse than COVID is going to come, and we're just not ready for it. So we're gearing up to build little factories that can be placed at strategic points worldwide, so you can deal with the next pandemic and produce a vaccine or a therapeutic on demand. So this is the technology of the future. Next slide. So there's many, many people behind, and these are all the people on the DARPA project. And again, it's a very diverse lab, people from about 9 countries, and at all stages, from undergraduate to postgraduate to senior people, etc., all working to make this happen. And that was really, so with that, thank you very much for your attention. Love to answer any questions, and thank you for this privilege.
Yeah, it was fun listening to all that you talked about. Govind and I are batchmates from IIT Madras. I worked in the healthcare industry too, but we've not really been able to discuss some of the things that he's talked about. I found it very fascinating. You talked about on-demand pharma product manufacture. Okay, first is, what kind of medicines are you able to produce out of that? And if you actually start doing that, will Kiran be happy with you?
Great point. So, again, it's a disruption to the pharma model. Our target is anything that any pharma company can make, we'd like to empower people to make it themselves. So it's a game changer. There's going to be lobbying against it. There's going to be entrenched interests against it, just like for the incubator. So, but you can't stop progress. So, and if it's progress that's empowering people, ultimately there will be a demand for it and people will adopt it. It's going to take time. Biotech, as you well know, in the healthcare industry, it's highly regulated. You can't just invent something new and sell it right away. So it takes time.
What we noticed in COVID, for example, the mRNA sequencing was done within a month. But the clinical trial process still takes a long time, and it's appropriate it takes a long time because you could get something wrong on scale. So are there any developments to try and crunch those kind of clinical trials so that it comes to market much faster? And just like the health secretary who asked you, are you experimenting with our children? So how do you provide that assurance, and is there any movement on that side? Because this seems to be phenomenal on one part of the whole solution, but we still need to be cautious when it comes to healthcare.
Great question. And I think COVID, one of the positives has been that it's jump-started the ability to get a vaccine out the door. The old Ebola or HIV vaccine, many of those trials are still running with no end in sight. Ebola took 18 months, and that was considered a record. It's been much quicker with COVID. So what's happening is the ability to monitor the patient reaction, and that's where these sensor technologies come in. If you're able to get much finer read on what the effect on the patient is and assess the effects of these various drugs, you could potentially do it with a smaller population size and much quicker. In fact, one of the biggest headaches for a drug company when they recruit patients for the trials is compliance, because the patients don't do what they're supposed to do. And so the data statistically shows a lot of variation. So these sensor technologies could help in alleviating some of those and speeding up the path to market.
Hi, good evening. My name is Vijay. I worked in G Healthcare for almost 15 years, and I could see a lot of familiar faces, Jeff Immelt and all that. I was in ultrasound in G. I also work with Phoenix, as I told you. She's a great friend of mine. I think one of the challenges for any startup and ideation is in terms of things go through valley of death. That's what we talk about in terms of. And in the healthcare innovation, I think that's much more prominent because you have to convince a lot of ecosystem around to really make sure that this reaches some level of scale. So how do you see industry changing in terms of, I know you have done a lot of work in terms of doing the clinical trials and all that. But if you want to bring it to, let's say, kind of at least initial pilots of all these innovation, what is the struggle you think you will have, or what are the challenges any inventor like you will face to really bring it out to the level where actually it can make a difference to the social objective which you already put for yourself?
No, that's a great question. And biotech healthcare is hampered by the fact that the gestation times are very long and the regulatory process takes time. So I can come up with a new iPhone today and start selling it tomorrow. The cardboard incubator, I can't till I get it through all the approval processes. So to get through the valley of the death, this is where the government needs to play a key role to provide grant funding, bridge funding. I'm also privileged to be on the scientific and technical advisory boards for the Department of Biotechnology's BIRAC, the Biotechnology Industry Research Assistance Council. And we're really trying to sort of point this out, that you need risk capital. And risk capital is hard to come by. And it's something that need more government support to then enable a company to get to a point where they can see a profit-making path ahead of them.
I'm Ashwini Tambi. Thank you so much. It has been, I'm a novice in anything to do with healthcare, but it has been quite inspiring, quite interesting. It has really boosted up our levels of knowledge understanding. So thank you so much for that. Just one thing I'm kind of wondering, it's kind of a comment, kind of a question, mix of both. You mentioned about the future of medicine when you said that a day should come when at home we should be able to manufacture on demand as per the need. Kind of reminds me our old ancient Ayurvedic system when fundamentally that's what used to happen. So is it like we are, the future is like going back to past, or if you could just throw some light onto that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's all about reaching a point where all this big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, getting us to a point where if we understand our individual responses to medicines, right now, the way medicine is, much as people tout about how high-tech it is, it's actually pretty low-tech. And the reason I say that is if I have high cholesterol, I get the same medicine that a woman might, or an African American might, or an Asian might. There's almost no accounting for our physiological differences, our dietary differences, etc. Whereas with the kind of human genome sequencing and the ability to follow metabolites, you can see how people react differently and then tailor-make the so-called personalized medicine. That's the way of the future that's coming.
Dr. Govind, wonderful presentation. And my name is Arun Cherian, founder of Rise Bionics, wherein we make bionics accessible to all. My question to you is with regard to the behavioral aspect of people getting access to low-cost healthcare, that is, the perception of quality. Interestingly, when we make affordable prosthetics and orthotics, be it for the leg, hand, spine, people ask about the price. And if it is low, there's a subconscious correlation to its low quality. And especially when it's an extension of their body or when it's come to their health, they would rather pay premium, even if they have to take a loan, just so that, that's better for them. And so counterintuitively, at Rise, we find out that putting it low cost is not helpful. Can you comment on that?
Yep, that's a great point. And in fact, Nachiket Moore also made this point. So it's really important. That's where social engineering comes in. If you're able to get a buzz around it, so then, if the cardboard incubator becomes a status symbol that, oh, my child was in it, or you get a sponsor, Amazon or Pepsi, splash a nice big ad on it, and in return, you get some benefits. There has to be incentives built in. And you're absolutely right that sometimes the perception is that if it's low cost, it's not good quality. But the demand is so high for some of these that I think that's a good problem to have, if you can at least provide a solution. Okay, quiz time.
So thank you so much, Dr. Rao. I mean, it was fabulous and was quite spellbound for the rest of the presentation. Thank you so much for
Thank you for having me.